Welcome to the Grim Reaper channel, where we bring you bone-chilling true stories from around the world. From haunted houses to unexplained disappearances, we have it all. So turn off the lights, grab a blanket, and get ready for a scare.
I can't remember a time I ever felt quite so uneasy. My name's Victor. I work at a hospital in the heart of Chicago. Late night shifts were part of the job, and usually I didn't mind, but that particular winter night was different. I just finished a grueling shift, and the chill in the air matched the exhaustion in my bones. With a deep sigh, I headed to Union Station, seeking the solace of my cozy apartment and the last train that would lead me there. Chicago was a city that never slept, but at this late hour, Union Station was almost as deserted as a ghost town. Echoes of laughter and distant conversations from the day's crowds seemed to linger, replaced by an eerie quiet that fell like a heavy curtain. The usually bustling station was a shell of its former self, the silence amplifying every clack of my heels against the cold tiles. The station seemed to swallow up sounds, muffling the distant rumble of an approaching train. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold ran down my spine. My stomach knotted, a primal part of me responding to the unusual silence. I pulled my coat tighter, attempting to shrug off the growing sense of unease. The entire place felt off. In the hushed gloom, figures huddled in corners stood out. Homeless folks who had sought refuge from the biting cold, their shivering forms the only signs of life. The sight usually spurred sympathy, but it only added to the creeping dread that night. An unspoken agreement hung in the air. They stuck to their corners, their eyes barely meeting mine as I walked by. My heart pounded in my chest. The lonely echo of footsteps, my only companion. I couldn't shake off the unsettling quiet that surrounded me. Union Station wasn't meant to be this silent, this still. As I boarded the near-empty train, I cast one last glance at the deserted station, the feeling of unease refusing to leave my side. The near-empty train welcomed me with a chilling hush, the rattling hum of the engine underneath like a sigh of relief in the stark silence. Sitting near the back, the once familiar rattling comfort of the train seemed distant and alien. Usually, I'd welcome the quiet. It was a chance to unwind after the tumult of the hospital, to close my eyes and let the rhythm of the tracks lull me into a brief respite. But that night, the silence was oppressive, amplifying the emptiness of the carriage. Empty seats, stretched out like shadows, faintly illuminated by the flickering overhead lights. The few other passengers were scattered, buried in their coats, lost in their worlds, their faces hidden. I was alone, yet not alone. In a train car where everyone was a stranger, it was unsettling, to say the least. Just as the doors were about to slide shut, a man boarded the train. His entrance was nearly cinematic. A flurry of snowflakes followed him inside, melting instantly on the warm floor of the carriage. He was bundled in a heavy coat, a scarf obscuring his face, and his eyes hidden behind a dark pair of glasses. As the doors slid closed behind him, sealing us away from the chilly night, he scanned the carriage before choosing a seat at the opposite end. There was no immediate reason to be alarmed. He was just another passenger, another face in the crowd. But a tingling sensation at the back of my neck, instinctual alertness, told me otherwise. I watched as he settled into his seat, his gaze briefly meeting mine before he turned away. His presence was an intrusion into the solitude of the carriage, a ripple in the pool of silence. It wasn't so much his appearance, but the energy around him. It felt predatory, like an unwelcome chill. Dismissing it as my overworked imagination, I settled into my seat, pulling my coat around me for warmth. The train jerked into motion, its familiar hum doing little to soothe my rattled nerves. I glanced out the window, watching the deserted station disappear into the night. But even as the cityscape rushed by, my mind kept drifting back to the stranger at the other end of the carriage. The train cut through the night as a dimly lit capsule, lost in the vastness of space. My gaze, however, remained fixed on the stranger, seated opposite me. There was a predatory intensity about him that prickled my skin. Every time I looked up, I'd find his gaze already on me, unblinking. The carriage was a cold landscape of anonymity, but in that void, I felt targeted, preyed upon. My mind wrestled with fears and what-ifs. Could it just be paranoia clawing at my already frayed nerves? Or was there a legitimate reason for the cold shiver of fear running down my spine? The train doors opened at each stop, inviting me to step out into the cold, deserted platforms. I'd hope, silently plead that he'd get off. But he stayed, like a statue, his eyes always on me. We were alone in this mutual silence, shared only with the rhythmic hum of the train. It was like being in a bubble, cut off from the world outside, yet a million miles away from safety. An unspoken dread began to pool within me. I thought about getting off at the next stop, but the prospect of standing alone on a dimly lit platform was just as frightening. As the train neared my stop, I gathered my belongings, a small measure of normalcy in the surrounding abnormality, but my heart pounded like a drum in my chest when the man, mirroring my actions, also stood up. He was following me. This was not mere coincidence or paranoia. It was real. The moment the train screeched to a halt at my station, I bolted from my seat, the clamor of my pounding heart drowning the sound of the closing train doors. I ran, my breath ragged, my boots slipping on the snow-laden platform. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps an echo of mine, a nightmarish soundtrack to this unsought chase. As I ran, the city was a blur of shadows and faint lights. The empty streets were a labyrinth, leading me away from safety. I was a stranger in my own city, a city I thought I knew like the back of my hand. The world around me had morphed into an unfamiliar landscape, painted with the colors of fear. My sanctuary was reduced to a stage of my own terror, with the man in the heavy coat as the antagonist. And yet, I ran. Fear was my fuel, adrenaline my guide. The chase was on, and I was the unwilling participant. As the icy wind sliced through my coat, each inhale was a struggle, and each exhale fogged up in the cold. The taste of fear was metallic in my mouth, sharp and biting. I could hear the man's footsteps echoing in the silent night, a terrifying reminder that I was not alone. Time seemed to stretch into an eternity. The only sounds were my heavy breathing and the crunch of snow under our chasing footsteps. It was a twisted game of cat and mouse, but there was nothing playful about it. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat screaming at me to run faster, to escape the nightmare thrust upon me. Then, through the veil of fear and the biting cold, I saw a beacon of hope. The warm glow of a 24-hour diner up ahead. The sight was like a lifeline, a flicker of safety amidst the relentless dread. Ignoring the burning in my lungs and the stinging cold, I pushed myself to run faster. The sound of the bell jingling above the diner door was the sweetest melody I had ever heard. As I stumbled inside, the sudden warmth engulfed me, wrapping me in its comforting embrace. The smell of coffee and the low murmur of late-night patrons starkly contrasted with the eerie silence outside. The few customers turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of surprise and concern. My lungs burned with each heaving breath, and my legs felt like jelly. But I was safe, at least for now. I had escaped the deserted streets, the haunting train, and the relentless chase. The diner's door creaked closed behind me, the bell's chime reverberating through the small space. The diner's gazes held a mix of curiosity and concern, their evening interrupted by my frantic entrance. My heart pounded in my chest. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and the adrenaline coursed through my veins like a raging river. I must have looked at sight, a woman chased by an unseen terror. "Help," I managed to gasp out, drawing the staff's attention behind the counter. "There's a man following me." Instantly, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to urgency. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, swiftly moved to call the police, her fingers shaking slightly as she dialed the numbers. Another staff member, a burly cook, stepped out from behind the kitchen counter, his gaze scanning the area outside the diner. A shiver ran down my spine as I dared to glance out the window. There he was, the man who had turned my night into a living nightmare. His gaze bore into mine, a cold and emotionless stare that sent chills down my spine. But there was something else, too. A twisted sort of satisfaction, as if he'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. Then, as swiftly as he had entered my life, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the shadowy streets. The terror he'd imposed lingered in his wake, an ominous reminder of the nightmare I'd just lived. The police arrived shortly after, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the quiet streets. I recounted my ordeal to them, my voice trembling, but my mind determined. As the police drove away, promising to investigate, I was left in the safety of the diner, shaken but alive. Looking out at the quiet street, the terrifying chase seemed almost unreal. But the fear that still prickled at my skin and the adrenaline coursing through my veins were all too real. As I eventually made my way home in the safety of a cab, one thing was clear. I was never going to take the last train home again. The quiet solitude I had once enjoyed was now tainted with terror. The man's face was etched into my memory, his chilling gaze a haunting reminder of the nightmare I'd escaped. I was safe, but the experience had left a mark, a shadow that lingered long after the fear had subsided.
We hope you enjoyed our spine-tingling stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on our latest uploads. Until next time, sweet dreams, if you can sleep at all.